Welcome, everybody, to Coffee Shop Thursday. Grab your cup and. Mm. Oh, are you wondering about this mug? OCD, Obsessive Chicken Disorder, happens to belong to Janice because, truly, folks, this is what she suffers from. Obsessive Chicken Disorder. Um, it's not such a bad thing. It's a lot of fun. Crazy at times, too. But hey, let's get on to our time here, drinking our coffee and talking about scriptures and what's that? Oh, you're wondering why we haven't read from the Old Testament for a while? Well, as you may have heard me in the past, I like the term Older Testament because it's also testimony to God's working in our lives, only it's the older section as opposed to the newer section, which are the Gospels and letters of Paul and all that kind of stuff, okay? All right. Why haven't we been doing that? Well, it's because the emphasis during the Easter season has focused a lot on the book of Acts as well, which we generally don't get to read out of except for this time of year. So, hey, but I know some of you noticed that for this Sunday, Pentecost Sunday, there was an alternate reading we could have done from the Older Testament, from the prophet Ezekiel. So why didn't we do that? Well, it's because the Acts reading talks about the giving of the Spirit. So we didn't want to miss out on that. However, this passage from Ezekiel is pretty awesome. I'm just going to read part of it to you. It's from the 37th chapter. So I, meaning Ezekiel, prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and all the bones, what bones? He had come across a field, a valley filled with bones laying everywhere. The bones came together, bone to its bone. I looked, and there were sinews on them, and flesh had come upon them, and skin had covered them. But there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, he being God, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, mortal, and say in the breath, thus says the Lord God, come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, a vast multitude. Then he said to me, mortal, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up, and our hope is lost. We're cut off. But therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God. I'm going to stop there, because then I'll tell you what God is saying to the people through this thing that's happened. All right, maybe we just need to have a little bit of background here. Ezekiel is a priest who had been carried off into exile during the Babylonian captivity. Now, there were two exiles of during the Babylonian captivity. One of those exiles was the first one in which Ezekiel was carried off. Nebuchadnezzar, remember that name? From Babylon had come in and laid siege to Jerusalem and took over all the good stuff from the temple, all the treasures, carried that off, kind of beat up the temple a little bit, and took all the brightest and best of the people, including Ezekiel, back to Babylon. Okay, so you have that going on. A little bit later, there was a rebellion of the people who were left in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes in again, takes a bunch of those people back, and this time he kills most of the inhabitants who were there. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and levels the city. So now Jerusalem's in ruins. Now, you're saying, okay, that's Jerusalem. That's the southern kingdom, Judah. What about the northern kingdom? Well, the northern kingdom had already been laid to waste earlier in the 8th century by Assyria. Right after Solomon was king, the nation of Israel was split in half, 10 tribes to the north, called Israel, 2 tribes to the south, called Judah, and the tribes to the north, Israel, had succumbed to the Assyrian Empire. And you might even hear the term the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Have you ever heard that? Well, that's those tribes, because once they were carried off into exile, they never fully returned and reestablished themselves in their homeland. Now, that's the difference between the people of Judah and Israel. Judah, they were carried off to Babylon, and they were allowed under Cyrus the Persian to return and get reestablished. Okay, just so you have that little bit of a background there. But Ezekiel, he's there in Babylon, and he is prophesying to the people there. Now, there's another prophet, a big one in our Older Testament, Jeremiah. He had remained back in Jerusalem, and he was prophesying at the same time, only to the people that remained in Jerusalem. Ezekiel had a lot of things to say to the people, a lot of words of judgment, because basically he was saying, this is your fault, people. You've been unfaithful, and this is your punishment. And he also has a lot of words to say to the nations that surround Israel as well. Not very good things about just how awful they were as well. And they were awful. However, in the end, and it starts right here, Ezekiel, the 37th chapter, is part of that. He brings forth a word of hope to the people. And that is what this vision was all about, where he's standing there in this valley of dry bones. Suddenly, well, why is it a valley of dry bones? Well, they were people in warfare who had been slain and killed. And you didn't bury your victims. You let them rot out there in the middle of nowhere. And that was a horrible thing. That was against all the things that were commanded in the Older Testament, that you buried your people. You didn't let them rot out in the open. Well, if there was no one left to do the job, that's what happened. And now here's Ezekiel, a priest, who's walking amongst the dead bodies. Well, they're just bones now. That's against the law. Everything's wrong about this. And yet God says, hey, speak to them. And he speaks to them, and they start coming back together, bone to bone, and then there's the muscles and the tendons, and then there's the skin. But did you notice? There's no breath yet. There's no breath at all. So one final time, he prophesies to the four winds. Breathe into the people. Remember, in the Older Testament, just as in the New Testament, what do we have? The word breath means wind, also means spirit. It's God's creative force, God's power coming back into the people. Now, what does it mean? What this prophecy meant for Ezekiel and for the people he was speaking to is God's going to restore our nation. We will return. There is hope for the future. It is God's Spirit that will pull this off. His breath breathing new life into us. That's what makes it such an appropriate lesson for Pentecost. Yeah, I know. We're not reading that in church on Sunday, and we should at some point, because it's, number one, it's really a cool passage to look at. And number two, it is a passage that's based on hope. And aren't we all people that go through different things in our lives in which we need hope? And we yearn for hope, yearn for God's presence in our life, His Spirit, His breath to breathe new life into us? You bet. And that's what makes it such a really neat Older Testament lesson for us. Ezekiel 37th chapter. Look it up. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but every now and then I go like this and you see, whoa, what's all this down here? It's so bright. That's because I'm letting my head stay in the shade so I can see what I'm doing. It's just another beautiful, bright, sunny day. Enjoy your day wherever you are. God's blessings be with you. And let His Spirit, His breath, His wind blow into your life this day. God's blessings be with you.